After my stroke, my own son and his wife took me in, but their kindness was a mask for their greed. They treated me like a helpless child in my own home, isolating me from my friends and tricking me into signing away control of my entire fortune. They thought I was weak, that their plan was perfect, and that I would just fade away quietly. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. And the satisfying way I dismantled their entire world piece by piece is a lesson they never saw coming. You know, the thing about a stroke is that it doesn't just weaken your body. It tries to weaken your claim on your own life. And my daughter-in-law Alyssa seemed to understand that better than anyone. It all started to become clear during one of those perfect Scarsdale Sunday brunches she loved to host in my garden. My garden. It was still legally mine, but everything in it, from the imported Belgian linen napkins to the precise arrangement of the quiches, was pure Alyssa. She moved among her guests with a smile so bright it could have powered the whole house, but I could see the tightness around her eyes. It was a smile that cost her something. That was the day she introduced the new rule. She did it so casually, bringing me a glass of iced tea with a practiced air of concern. She explained to everyone within earshot that for my own safety, to prevent any falls, I was to use the little blue plastic step stool if I needed anything from the kitchen cabinets. A child's stool. I looked at it sitting by the counter, a bright, humiliating piece of plastic in my own home. I'm 79, a retired university librarian who once managed a collection of 500,000 books, and now I needed a toddler's stool to get a teacup. I didn't argue, of course. Arguing with Alyssa is like wrestling with a spreadsheet. She just rearranges the numbers until you're the one who looks foolish. So I simply nodded, the perfect, grateful mother-in-law, while a cold knot of something hard and clear formed in my chest. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. The isolation started so subtly, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. My weekly calls with Eleanor, my best friend since my university days, suddenly went unanswered. When I'd ask my son Caleb if she'd called, he'd just look vaguely uncomfortable and say Alyssa was handling my calls to let me rest. One afternoon, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, came by with a pot of her famous azaleas. I saw her from my window, but Alyssa met her on the porch, and through the glass, I watched her use that brilliant, brittle smile. I saw her polite but firm headshake, the gesture of putting a hand on Mrs. Gable's arm, a pantomime of deep concern for my fragile health. Mrs. Gable left, looking confused and a little hurt. My phone, a simple little thing Caleb had bought me, started going missing. My iPad, which I used for my audiobooks, was always out of battery, the charger nowhere to be found. I was being gently, lovingly, and systematically erased from my own life. The real betrayal, though, came on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because the landscapers were there, and the noise from the leaf blowers had given me a splitting headache. I was exhausted, that deep cellular exhaustion that's been my constant companion since the stroke. Alyssa found me in the sunroom, her voice softer than usual. She said she was so worried about me getting overwhelmed with bills and all the complex paperwork from my investment portfolios. She just wanted to simplify things to take that burden off my shoulders. She spread a thick sheaf of documents on the table in front of me, a pen already clicked and waiting. She pointed to the signature lines, her manicured finger tapping on each one. Her explanation was a blur of financial jargon, consolidating accounts, fiduciary responsibilities, simplifying the estate. My mind, usually so sharp, felt like a fogged-up window. I just wanted the headache to stop. I wanted to lie down. So I signed. I signed every page. She pointed to my hand, barely forming the letters of my own name. I just wanted it to be over. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house was finally quiet, the forced cheerfulness of the day packed away with the good china. My bedroom was downstairs now, a converted study that felt more like a waiting room. than a part of my own home. It was well after midnight when I heard the floorboards creaking in the hall. It was Alyssa, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper into her phone. She must have thought I was asleep. I held my breath, straining to hear. The words came in sharp, panicked fragments slicing through the silence. She wasn't talking about household bills. I heard her say, "Not a liquidity issue, it's gone." A pause, then a choked sound. "Eeh." The entire principal. Her voice cracked on the last part, and it was the sound of pure terror. "I have to have access before the end of the quarter, or they'll find out." I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding against my ribs. And in that moment, the fog in my mind finally cleared. This whole performance, the suffocating care, the isolation, the condescending plastic stool, it wasn't about my health at all. It was about my money. And it was all gone. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. After a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, replaying those whispered, panicked words in my head, I knew one thing for certain. The frail, confused old woman they wanted me to be was gone for good. In her place was a librarian who knew how to find information and a woman who was about to defend her life's work. My first move had to be a probe, a small, calculated question to see how they would react to pressure. I chose my moment carefully. It was the next evening during one of our silent, tense dinners. Caleb was picking at his food, and Alyssa was watching me like a hawk, as if she could hear my thoughts. I put down my fork, dabbed my lips with a napkin, and adopted the most wistful, faraway look I could manage. I turned to my son Caleb and asked him in a soft, grandmotherly voice if he remembered that delightful municipal bond fund my late husband and I had invested in decades ago. It was a specific, rather boring fund, not something one would easily forget if they were managing my portfolio. The effect was immediate. It was like I'd tossed a live grenade onto the dinner table. Caleb's eyes went wide with a sort of blank panic. He clearly had no idea what I was talking about. He started to stammer something about the markets being volatile and how things get consolidated over time. But before he could form a complete sentence, Alyssa jumped in. Her voice was sharp and overly bright, a complete contrast to Caleb's fumbling. She launched into a highly technical explanation about fund restructuring and tax loss harvesting, using a barrage of jargon that was meant to confuse and intimidate me. The problem was, her slick corporate speak answer had absolutely nothing to do with Caleb's vague muttering about market changes. Their stories didn't just fail to align, they crashed into each other head-on. And in their panic, they gave me the one thing I needed most confirmation. I nodded slowly, pretending to be satisfied. But inside, I felt a cold, clear certainty. They were lying, and they were terrible at it. My next move had to be to establish a line of communication to the outside world. My opportunity came 2 days later during my weekly home visit from the physical therapist, a kind young woman named Sarah. Alyssa always insisted on being present for these sessions, hovering under the guise of being a supportive daughter-in-law. While Sarah had me doing leg exercises, I waited for the right moment. With a theatrical little groan, I pretended to lose my balance slightly and knocked a full glass of water off the side table. It was a perfect crash. Water went everywhere. Just as I'd planned, both Caleb and Sarah rushed to get paper towels. Alyssa, ever the perfectionist, was horrified by the mess. For about 30 seconds, every eye in the room was on the puddle spreading across the hardwood floor. Sarah had left her smartphone on the small table next to my chair. My hands trembled, but I moved with a speed I didn't know I still possessed. I grabbed the phone. My fingers, clumsy from the stroke, felt like sausages, but I managed to open her messages. I had memorized the number years ago. My old estate lawyer, Mr. Davison. I typed a single frantic line, "Call me, urgent, Virginia Fletcher." I hit send, deleted the message from her outbox, and placed the phone back on the table just as Sarah turned around. No one saw a thing. Alyssa must have sensed something, though. Perhaps it was a new look in my eyes, or maybe her own guilt was making her paranoid. She didn't know what I'd done, but she knew she was losing her grip. That evening, she came into my room holding my personal checkbook and my last remaining credit card. She didn't even bother with the soft, caring voice. Her tone was cool and efficient. She told me that based on the authority I had granted her in the documents I'd signed, she was closing these accounts to simplify the bookkeeping. She would handle all my expenses from now on. I just stared at her as she took them the flimsy plastic card and the worn leather checkbook that represented the last vestiges of my financial independence. The bars of my gilded cage had just become cold, hard steel. This wasn't just about stealing from me anymore. This was about erasing me completely. I realized then that the situation was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. My mind is a library, and in the days that followed, I locked the doors and pulled the shades. To the outside world, and more importantly to Alyssa, the lights went out. I began my strategic retreat. The stroke had given me a perfect blueprint for what was expected of a declining woman, and I played the part with the skill of a seasoned actress. I became more forgetful, asking the same question twice in an hour. I moved more slowly, my hands trembling just a little more when I reached for a glass. I stopped asking about my friends or my mail. When Alyssa would tell me about a new decision she'd made regarding the household, I would just nod with a vacant, placid smile. I let her see a woman who was fading beaten. And just as I'd hoped, I saw the tension in her shoulders begin to relax. She stopped watching me so closely. She believed she had won. Her brief rebellion had been crushed, and her control was now absolute. She had no idea I was simply giving her the rope she needed. What I didn't know then was the sheer depth of her desperation. Late one night, as I lay awake, Alyssa was in her home office, staring at a computer screen that held the source of all her poison. It wasn't a bank statement, but a glossy, fraudulent prospectus from a company that no longer existed, an investment fund that had promised impossible returns and delivered only ruin. It was a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, and she had fallen for it completely, taking not just her and Caleb's savings, but also off-the-books money from a few private clients she'd foolishly tried to manage on the side. A new email sat in her inbox, its subject line glowing with menace. It was from one of those clients, a man who had entrusted his entire retirement to her. The message was short and brutal. He knew the fund was a sham, and he wanted his life savings back within the week, or he was going to the authorities and the press. Staring at the screen, Alyssa wasn't just a cruel daughter-in-law. She was a cornered animal, terrified of the public humiliation she considered a fate worse than death. While Alyssa was consumed by her terror, I was using my feigned weakness to prepare. My long afternoon naps became my war room. Propped up on my pillows, eyes closed, I wasn't sleeping, I was working. Years ago, my husband had insisted I keep a small, old-fashioned address book with a leather cover, a hard copy of our entire financial life. Alyssa had never thought to look for something so antiquated. I kept it tucked under my mattress. During those quiet hours, I would pull it out. My mind, free from the burden of performance, was as sharp as ever. I mentally walked through every account, every stock, every property deed. I rehearsed account numbers and passwords. I mapped out the timeline of Alyssa's deception and formulated the precise points I would lay out for Mr. Davison when he finally called. I was a librarian cataloging my arsenal, preparing my case piece by painstaking piece. The arrogance of a victor is their greatest weakness. Convinced she had neutralized me, Alyssa became careless. One afternoon, she took a call in the kitchen, just down the hall from my room. She must have assumed I was napping. Her voice was confident, professional. She was speaking to a real estate agent. I heard her using words like quick valuation, motivated to sell, and streamlined closing. She was talking about my house, my home of 45 years. It wasn't just a vague plan anymore. She was actively trying to sell it out from under me. I lay perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was her endgame. This was how she planned to get the money to cover her disaster, and I knew with chilling certainty that my lawyer's call couldn't come soon enough. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the bell to ring. I continued my performance of a frail, fading woman, but inside, every nerve was coiled tight. Every time the phone rang, every car that drove past the house, I held my breath. Alyssa, meanwhile, was glowing with a new, feverish energy. She had a plan. She had a solution. She saw the finish line. The doorbell finally rang on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the living room, supposedly dozing in my armchair. Alyssa answered it with a note of impatience in her voice, annoyed by the interruption. Standing on my porch was a man whose calm demeanor was a force of nature in itself, Mr. Davison, my lawyer for the past 30 years. He was dressed in a simple suit, holding a leather briefcase, and he looked entirely unflappable. Alyssa tried to block his entry, explaining with her practiced, condescending sympathy that I wasn't up for visitors. Mr. Davison simply smiled a thin, professional smile and informed her he was here for a routine follow-up, an appointment we had scheduled via text. The word text made the color drain from Alyssa's face. She had to let him in. He walked into the living room, greeted me warmly, and then turned his attention to Alyssa and Caleb, who had emerged from his study to see what the commotion was about. Mr. Davison opened his briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. He explained in a calm and steady voice that he was simply there to deliver an official notice. He handed it to Alyssa. It was a legally executed document signed by me and a notary just the day before during a physical therapy session that was actually a secret meeting in Sarah's car. The document stated in no uncertain terms that the durable power of attorney she had tricked me into signing was now null and void. Revoked. That single sheet of paper broke her. Alyssa's carefully constructed world of control and deception shattered into a million pieces. She stared at the document, her hands shaking, and a terrible, guttural sob escaped her lips. It wasn't a performance. It was the sound of a soul collapsing. In front of my son, in front of the lawyer, she had underestimated the whole story, came pouring out in a torrent of tears and desperate, fragmented sentences. The Ponzi scheme that had promised the world. The life savings, all of it gone. The other clients she'd secretly advised, the ones who were now threatening to ruin her. She confessed that my money, my house, was her only way out. She admitted she had to sell the house, that it was the only thing left that could save her from total public humiliation and financial ruin. I watched Caleb as his wife's confession washed over him. His face went from confusion to disbelief to a pale, sickened horror. This was the man who had stood by, who had enabled every small cruelty, telling himself it was for my own good. Now he was learning the truth. The humiliation, the isolation, the theft of my independence, it was all built on a desperate, selfish lie. It wasn't to protect me. It was to use me as a shield to protect her from the consequences of her own catastrophic mistakes. I saw the moment their alliance fractured. He looked at his weeping, broken wife not with sympathy, but with a dawning, absolute disgust. The foundation of their marriage cracked right there on my living room carpet. In the ensuing silence, broken only by Alyssa's ragged sobs, I felt a strength I hadn't felt in years. The frail woman in the armchair was gone. I sat up a little straighter. My voice when I spoke was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. I informed them both that Mr. Davison was now acting as the temporary trustee of my entire estate. Everything was now locked away legally and completely beyond her reach. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I turned my gaze from my horrified son and looked directly at the woman who had tried to erase me. The next discussion we have, I told her, will be about the terms under which I will allow you to continue living in my house. My final word in the living room hung in the air for days, a promise of a reckoning to come. Alyssa and Caleb moved through the house like ghosts, the silence between them thick with the poison of her confession. There was no more pretense of care, only the heavy, suffocating weight of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I did not drop it in my home. That space had been violated enough. Instead, Mr. Davison arranged what he formally called a family financial meeting in the neutral territory of his firm's conference room. The room itself was designed to strip away emotion, a long mahogany table, gray walls, and cold fluorescent lighting. I insisted 2 other people be present. My grandson Thomas, a good-hearted boy of 19, who deserved to know the truth from me, not from bitter gossip. And Mr. Henderson, my bank manager of 20 years, a man whose professional discretion was matched only by his sharp eye for financial misconduct. We sat at the table, a grim tableau. Alyssa was pale and drawn, her usual polished armor gone, leaving only a raw, nervous fragility. Caleb sat beside her, but a world away, his face a mask of shame and exhaustion. I began, my voice calm and measured, and then passed the floor to Mr. Davison. Systematically, he laid out the evidence on the gleaming table. He started with the power of attorney I'd been tricked into signing, followed immediately by the legal notice that revoked it. He produced bank statements showing flagged inquiries made by Alyssa into accounts she had no authority to touch. He placed the real estate valuation she had ordered for my home in the center of the table. Each piece of paper was a nail in the coffin of her deception. Then Mr. Davison presented our masterstroke the documents for a newly created ironclad revocable trust. He explained calmly that every one of my assets from my portfolio, down to the silverware in my dining room, was now legally owned by the trust with him as the sole trustee. My financial world was now a fortress, and Alyssa was on the outside. To punctuate this, I made a final announcement. I told them I had formed a separate, untouchable trust for Thomas, fully funding his education and his future. I wanted my grandson and everyone else to see where my legacy would truly go. There was no screaming, no dramatic confrontation. The judgment, when it came, was silent and absolute. It was in the way Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, looked at Alyssa with a cool, professional disappointment, a look that silently condemned her as both a fool and a thief. Her reputation as a former wealth manager evaporated under that quiet, damning gaze. But the real punishment came from her own son. I watched Thomas. He didn't look angry. He looked heartbroken. The profound, shattering disappointment in his eyes as he looked at his mother was a verdict more painful than any court could deliver. In that sterile, fluorescent-lit room, Alyssa's standing as a wife, a mother, and a member of our family simply ceased to exist. She was no longer a threat. She was just a tragedy of her own making. With everything laid bare, it was time for the consequences. I looked at Alyssa and Caleb not with anger, but with a kind of sad finality. I told them my decision was made. The Scarsdale house, my home, would be put on the market immediately. They would have 60 days to find somewhere else to live and to vacate the premises. I explained that I would not be pressing criminal charges for fraud. The family had been damaged enough, and my goal was not cruel vengeance. But I made it clear our financial relationship was severed permanently. There would be no support, no inheritance, nothing. This wasn't a punishment meant to inflict pain. It was surgery. A clean, necessary cut to remove the disease that had infected our family, allowing what was left to finally heal. It was a firm, unbreakable boundary. It was justice. The 60 days I gave them were 60 days of silence. I moved out of the house the very next day, letting Mr. Davison handle all the logistics. I couldn't bear to watch them pack up the life they had tried to steal. My own new life was already waiting. I can only imagine what it was like inside that house. A slow, resentful dismantling of a life built on appearances. I picture them wrapping expensive, meaningless trinkets in newspaper, the silence between them thick with blame. All that frantic effort, all that cruelty just to end up in a small rented condo with a view of a parking lot. The Scarsdale status they had valued more than family was the first thing to be packed away, and the first thing to be lost for good. In the months that followed, their paths diverged exactly as you might expect. My son Caleb called me one evening. His voice was quiet, hesitant, and heavy with a shame that was years overdue. He told me he'd taken a new, much more humbling job. He tried to apologize. It wasn't a perfect apology. He stumbled over the words, and I could tell he still didn't fully comprehend the depth of his inaction, but it was a start. It was the sound of a man beginning to take accountability for his own life. Alyssa, on the other hand, learned nothing. From what Thomas has told me, she remains bitter, trapped in a cycle of denial. She blames the man who ran the Ponzi scheme, she blames the volatile market, and most of all, she blames me. In her story, she is the victim, and she will likely remain so for the rest of her life. Some people, when their world collapses, are determined to rebuild. Others just sit in the rubble and curse the stones. But my world wasn't collapsing. It was finally blossoming. I found a beautiful apartment in a modern building overlooking the Hudson River. Everything is accessible. The doors are wide and the windows are vast, flooding the rooms with light. The bars of my gilded cage are gone. My old friends, like Eleanor, are back in my life, our weekly calls filled with the easy laughter that Alyssa had tried so hard to silence. My grandson Thomas visits often. We don't just talk about his classes. We sit together and go over my real financial statements. I show him how a balanced portfolio works, how to read the markets, how to plan for a future built on wisdom, not on desperate gambles. I am not just giving him a safety net. I am teaching him how to weave one for himself. My legacy won't just be money in a trust. It will be the strength and knowledge I pass on to him. Just this morning, the real estate agent called. The Scarsdale house, my home for 45 years, had a very strong all-cash offer. There was no hesitation in my voice, no trace of nostalgia for the place that had become my prison. I calmly accepted it. After I hung up the phone, I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea and sat in my favorite armchair by the window. I watched the river flow, a steady, powerful current moving toward the sea. The pain of the last year wasn't entirely gone, but it no longer had any power over me. I had won my freedom, yes, but I had also forged something more valuable. I had transformed my suffering into a lesson of strength for the person who mattered most, ensuring that my story would not be a quiet tragedy, but a legacy of quiet power. In the end, Virginia's story wasn't just about a quiet woman finding her voice. It was about a wise woman knowing which voice to trust. Her sharp mind was the weapon, but it was useless until she found an ally to wield it in the world she was barred from. She learned that true strength isn't always about standing alone against the storm. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to send a single urgent message, trusting that a loyal friend will be strong enough to answer the call and help you navigate the way back to shore.